Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. I'm June Raw, the director for IPPENDIX, and I'm so happy you could join us today. In today's webinar, we will be discussing the new Florida Department of Education Adult Employability Curriculum Frameworks. Remember, this is a series, part 2 of a series of introducing the new adult education standards. I just wanted to point out a few things about these employability frameworks and describe to you that these standards are really crafted to let students know what they should be able to do in order to be ready to enter the workforce and be successful across different career pathways. I'm really excited about this webinar, and I'm truly confident that you will walk away from today's webinar with new ideas and new ways that you can infuse these standards into your daily instruction. Joining me today is Shira and Molly again, who will be facilitating our conversation, and we also have the Florida Department of Education with us, Rachel Ludwig. So with that, Shira, Molly, I'm going to turn it over to you to present today's webinar. But first, let me just remind you of a few housekeeping rules. You know that if you do have a question, please type it in the Q&A section, and we will be monitoring that throughout the webinar and addressing your questions throughout. You all are in listen-only mode, so your microphones are muted. Like all presentations, they are recorded and they will be archived on the IPPENDIX website within 48 hours. Now, Molly, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome, thanks. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Molly DePasquale, and I'm here with my colleague Shira. And we are former classroom teachers, deep standards, lovers of standards, experts of standards, frameworks, and we're very excited again to help you start to understand some of the key changes to the employability standards frameworks that we really think will help our adult education programs across the state better serve the needs of their students and better prepare them for the workforce. So and in order to do that, we have a couple objectives that we're going to be tackling. We're going to start by just providing some background around the development of the new standards. We'll talk about the process that we went through. Then we want to highlight some key shifts in the structure of the new standards, just so that you're oriented to the documents and you know where to access key information and details in the new framework documents. And the last piece is we want to help you orient to 3 key design principles that were central in the design and the development of the content. At the end, we're actually going to give you an opportunity to internalize the standards. We're going to do a scavenger hunt activity. Definitely stay on for that, because that'll be sort of a rubber meets the road opportunity for you to really roll up your sleeves and get familiar with the standards themselves. Okay, so a little background. Many of you may be familiar with Executive Order 1931 that was signed by Governor DeSantis in 2019. And really what it put forward is a vision for improving how well Florida students are prepared for the jobs of the future, right? So how can we really meet the demands of the economy across the state of Florida and prepare our graduates of our secondary, post-secondary programs across the state for those jobs, so that we have the homegrown talent to meet the demands of the workforce. And a key part of this, really, in order to live out that vision, is described in this integrated education and training guide. And so essentially what it calls for is adult education programs really integrating three sets of content in their instruction. The academic standards, which is what Shira and I presented on last week, the employability skills to ensure that students and graduates have the soft skills that are necessary to be successful in the workforce, alongside the sector-specific knowledge that they will need to be ready to enter careers in certain industries. So just, a little background to keep in your minds that really, again, all of what we're going to present to you today is in service of helping realize this vision to better prepare students for jobs of the future. So this standards development process started similar to how we approach the academic standards work, with a good deal of research. So what Shira and I did was we looked across the 50 states and we looked at what are the employability and the job ready standards frameworks that are currently in use. What is the landscape, the variability in terms of how states, different SEAs, are defining what those employability skills need to be for students. And we saw high variability. So not surprisingly, there were about 11% of states that were using something that was word for word the Perkins framework. In some cases, there were Perkins-like frameworks that were in use. In about 20% of states, it was unclear what framework was being used to define these job-ready soft skills. And then in about 50% of states, there was something that was homegrown in place. So something that had been developed by leaders within the state that was unique to the state, and may or may not have some resemblance to the Perkins framework, or, another common framework that was commonly used as the 21st century framework that, Virginia in particular uses. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of the lay of the land, this is the starting place of ABE and ASE programs across the country. And it was really helpful in sort of setting the stage for us as we launched into the design work that Shira is going to talk a little bit more about.
Great, thanks, Molly. Shira here, nice to be back this week to be able to talk through the employability standards with you all today. So as Molly talked about, we started with research, and then ultimately that decision was made to create a set of employability standards for the state of Florida. And so we once again, similar to how we had done the development work around the academic standards, we engaged a working group of Florida adult education folks, educators and administrators from across the state. And this was kind of, for those of you who were here last week, this was sort of going on simultaneously to the academic working groups, as the academic standards working groups. So in October, at the end of October, we had the kickoff. In December 6th, we were able to meet all together to provide feedback and input on the standards and work together. In December and January, there was an asynchronous feedback and input cycle. We met together again with the full working group at the end of January, and were able to resolve all the feedback and finalize the standards in time to be able to submit to the State Board of Ed in February. So I wanted to just kind of highlight quickly some of those folks involved in the employability working group who were absolutely instrumental in providing such incredible value, insight and feedback into this tool so that it could be a really helpful resource in supporting educators and thinking about what those employability skills needed to include to support adult learners across the state. So I'm going to talk about a little bit the structure of what you're going to see towards the end, where we have some time to dig into the standards themselves. So the employability framework, as you'll see when you get a chance to dig into it, includes 3 strands. And these are going to be consistent with the Perkins framework that we'll talk about in a little bit. So there's applied knowledge, effective relationships, and workplace skills. Those are the 3 strands. And there are a total of 8 standards, which I'll show you in just a minute, across and within those 3 strands, right? So you'll see that this strand has the name applied knowledge, and then a set of the abbreviation for it, as well as the standard number. And then you'll see the name of the standard, critical thinking, as well as the full description of the standard itself. So here are the 8 employability standards in the new framework, right? As I mentioned, there are those 3 strands: applied knowledge, effective relationships, and workplace skills. There are the 8 standards across those 3 strands. The language of each standard includes a description of what students should be able to do, along with why or for what purpose. So for example, if you look at WS04, which is resource management, you'll see students manage time, money, resources, and personnel in group projects to complete tasks in service of minimizing waste and improving organizational efficiency. So you'll see as you look at the language of each standard that they're all phrased similarly to describe what students should be able to do and why or for what purpose. And then you'll see on the far right here the coding scheme that I showed you on the previous slide. So this chart is all in the front matter of the standards framework document. So this, you'll see this somewhere within that first 4 pages. I think it's towards the end, like right around on page 4 of that employability skills framework. I'm going to pass it to Molly, who's going to talk a little bit about the underlying design principles that informed the development of these standards.
Great, thanks, Shira. And so as part of the work, we defined actually 6 design principles. And those were co-created with the amazing members of the working group. And those, again, I mentioned that they were the anchor for our work, but essentially they were our touchstone. We kept going back to them to make sure that we were living out our commitments to improving these standards so that the standards were easier to use by teachers who were working with adults, and so that they really solved for some of the pain points in the existing framework. Now, again, we didn't want to sort of throw everything out, right? The Perkins Employability Skills Framework is a strong framework. The workforce readiness or workforce preparation activities that are outlined or that were outlined in the previous version of the adult basic education standards, you know, those are a really good starting place. But we also felt like, and this was very much informed by the feedback of your colleagues, that there was room for improvement, right? Very often the employability soft skills, they feel sort of like this squishy, nebulous thing that it's really unclear, especially for our adult program or educators who are working in adult education programs or the leaders of those programs, to really understand, like, what do these things mean? What does success look like? How will I know that a student developed interpersonal skills? And so the idea all along was, if we set up the right design principles that tie to those problems that we're trying to solve, that we will have a stronger framework that's going to be a much clearer roadmap or blueprint for the knowledge and skills that need to be built in our learners to ensure that they are job ready. So we're going to focus on a subset of those design principles. The first one is being tied to a national framework. There's a lot of research and thought that again went into the development of the Perkins Employability Skills Framework. There's a lot of thought that has gone into the development and what it constitutes the WIOA's workforce preparation activities. And again, we wanted to start from there so that we're anchoring on a research-based framework and a industry respected framework. We also wanted to make sure that we were improving measurability. Earlier, I mentioned things being a bit sort of squishy and nebulous. How do I know, again, that that student has developed interpersonal skills or critical thinking? And so you'll see some really important moves in the design of the new standards to help clarify, what does success look like at various levels? So the standards have been written along progressions. We've included really specific language and sample artifacts, again, to just make it really clear, what does a student being able to successfully demonstrate this skill, what does it really look like in the inside and outside of the classroom? And the last piece, and this was so important to the leaders working with us in the working group, was equitable access, right? We have such diversity in our programs. We have such varied learning needs when we consider sort of the pool of students in our programs, and even across the types of programs that serve adult learners, that it felt really important to allow for an entry point for all learners, regardless of their starting point, right? We know there's diagnostic and baseline testing that's done for learners when they enroll in programs. Those often, again, reflect sort of the variability and diversity of students' needs. And so we didn't want this standards framework to be one size fits all. We wanted, again, there to be entry points for all students, regardless of their starting place. And you'll see that reflected in how each standard has been written along a continuum. And we've defined what that skill looks like from the novice level to all the way up to advanced.
Great. So I'm going to dig into those first two principles a little bit that Molly just highlighted, just to give a little bit additional context. So as Molly mentioned, talking about starting from and grounding in the national framework and really thinking about that kind of from two perspectives that are really helpful to make sure we stay grounded in it. The first is WIOA. What are the workforce preparation activities? How do we make sure we're consistent? And so we can ensure that programs who are utilizing these skills are going to be in compliance, right? And so ultimately that includes such things as critical thinking skills, digital literacy skills, and self-management skills. Again, there's some different sometimes like variation in language and terminology and that was a big part of the variability that we saw across states, but making sure that as we use this as a guiding tool to think about what are the skills that need to be covered in an employability framework. Similarly, as Molly mentioned, we started with the Perkins Employability Skills Framework as our starting point, right? And again, for all of the reasons that were mentioned, and this, for those who maybe aren't as familiar with it, right, the Perkins Collaborative Resource Network is ultimately, this framework is developed from the U.S. Department of Ed, their Office of CTE and Adult Education. And so making sure that we started with this because the architecture and the research behind it is really helpful. And as we saw, there are reasons why states called on this, whether explicitly or sometimes less directly in their development of employability skills frameworks. We gave it some labels. So if you were to go to the Perkins website, you wouldn't see the labels strand and standard. We started with adding those labels structurally so that there would be nice continuity with the academic standards. So we think about these strands, right? The three overarching strands are applied knowledge, workplace skills, and effective relationships. And then the use of the word standard. In this case, there are 8 standards. One noticeable absence I just want to name here. The applied academic skills is in the Perkins employability framework. It is not. It is the only one that is not reflected in the new Florida employability skills framework. That is because it was redundant and duplicative of the new academic standards, which we talked about in the Unboxing Part 1 webinar last week. So again, in thinking about wanting to make this a simple, the design principle around simplicity and user friendliness, which is included in the appendix here, was also really important. How do we make a really user-friendly tool? And so we don't have a lot of redundancy or overlap where someone has to reference multiple different frameworks in order to understand what the expectations are. So from there, we built out and started this, this in-depth development process with the working group to produce this content for each standard. So this is what each standard looks like. I'm going to walk you through the pieces of each standard and ways in which this helps live out that design principle around measurability. And so this is literally what you will see. And I think this visual tool is also in the front matter of the standards framework document itself. So you'll always be able to reference this whenever you need it. But this is what each of the 8 standards looks like in the standards framework. So I'm going to walk you through a few of these pieces. At the top, you'll see the name of the strand. Directly underneath that, in that pinkish color, is going to be the code and the standard, the full standard language. Underneath that in blue are the situational examples. Situational examples are examples of how the skills in this standard might show up in real life contexts. It's really just an opportunity to think about how these skills connect in terms of practical applicability and to think about how students might be able to draw meaningful connections in various other places in their lives. You also then have in that sort of orange colored box, that's where you have the sample skills continuum that Molly mentioned and is also going to talk about more on the next slide as well. The sample skills continuum shows the development of skills in the standard from novice to proficient to advanced. And each of the skills also has a bullet underneath it at each level that includes examples of what these skills could look like in practice. So these are illustrative examples to add clarification and specificity, but they are not required look-fors, meaning there are many different kinds of examples, many different ways in which students might demonstrate development of any given skill. Lastly, in that yellowish box, you're going to see what are sample artifacts. So the sample artifacts are activities or they're activities that could be used for instruction or assessment through which students might develop or demonstrate mastery of skills within each standard. A couple of things about this sample artifacts list. So the sample artifact, the sample artifacts are, this is not an exhaustive or comprehensive list, right? These artifacts are not required tasks for any standard. And these sample artifacts are tasks that could be used across all the proficiency levels, right? They're tasks that could be utilized with students and should be accessible to students at all levels and regardless of learning differences. I want to mention one caveat, which you may have just seen pop up on my screen. the actual employability skills framework, which you all will have a minute to dig into in a second. There's a disclaimer, or not a disclaimer, just a provision on page 4 that I wanted to highlight for you all, which is just that the continuum of skills within any given standard is really to help think about and isolate developmental progression of those skills, but it's not a rubric, right? This came up a lot in the working group, this desire to have a rubric, which it makes perfect sense. And it even looks visually kind of like a rubric. But when we think about, and certainly this resource, this standards framework could be used to develop a rubric, right? But when we think about this standard critical thinking, students use creative, analytical, and strategic thinking to solve problems and explore opportunities. And we are looking at this standards framework and digging into the skills embedded within that standard. When we think about how we would actually utilize a task in the context of an educational program, it would also be that task in the context of a curriculum would also be addressing other employability skills, also probably academic skills, right? If you look at that sample artifact, that first one, which says written essay on a local, national, or global problem with proposed solutions. If you were to utilize a task such as a written essay in your, in your educational setting, you might be then targeting critical thinking skills, but you might be also targeting other skills through that same task. And so a rubric could be an incredibly useful tool that would allow you to think about how you're measuring student progress across multiple skills, right? And so this resource would be very valuable in helping to think about developing a rubric in the context of a high quality set of curricular and assessment materials used for instruction, but in and of itself is not a rubric. So that was something that a point of confusion or just a point of discussion that I think came up in the working group that I wanted to highlight for you all. I'm going to pass it to, and again, that information that I just shared is also in the description of the standards itself, so you can reference back all of these descriptions. So I'm going to pass it to Molly then to talk a little bit more about that third principle that she talked about.
Great, thanks, Shira. And so that third principle is equitable access. And again, the purpose of this principle is really to ensure that there are multiple entry points or entry points for students, given that we know that there's a variety of skills in all of our programs across the state. So we want to ensure that there is, an entry point for all that takes into account the diversity and the diverse needs of our learners. So this particular example is from under the effective relationships strand, and it's specifically related to interpersonal skills. So again, you can see sort of this is like a double click into the slide that Shira just shared, that there is this continuum from novice to proficient to advanced, right? So for some of our students, what might be more accessible to them or the appropriate entry point is identifying expectations for participation in group settings. The proficient learner might actually be able to participate and listen actively in a group setting, adhering to the agreed upon norms. Whereas at the advanced level, we might see students who are adapting their participation to the context. So perhaps they're assisting their peers to meet expectations, or they're playing sort of a different role or adapting their participation based on the needs of the group. So again, this is what this skill looks like across a continuum. And the hope is to provide a bar for all of our students to be working towards, regardless of their starting place. You'll also see the specific examples that are called out help to really clarify what is meant by that, the standards language above. Great, so hopefully you understand now a little, or have had a little taste of how all of these design principles were really carefully considered in the development of the standards framework that we're about to give you time to dig into. So we're going to do a scavenger hunt. And the first thing I want you to do is to locate the employability skills framework on the Florida Adult Education website. So Shira's going to show you how to do this. And you'll want to download this too, so that you've got it handy, not just for today, but for the future as well. So here you are. You can go to the Florida Adult Education Curriculum Frameworks page. And then right there under resources, that very first one is your employability skills standards. So if you click on it, it will prompt you to download it. And then once you've done that, you will be ready for the scavenger hunt. So I'll give everybody a minute or two just to get settled and to take care of that step. Shira's also put the link to this page in the Zoom chat for you. Okay, so here's the scavenger hunt. Now that you have the employability skills framework downloaded and accessible, you'll want to look at all the standards and think about, what do you notice? How is this different from the previous workforce prep activities? And where do you see evidence that the standards build from that national Perkins framework? Once you're done with that, you'll want to go deeply into the critical thinking standard rather, and review the components. And you want to surface any evidence of measurability. So what do you see that will help your educators measure students' development? And then what evidence do you see that is supporting equitable access for all learners? Okay, so the idea is this is a scavenger hunt. So we want you to get your, roll up those sleeves, dig in, get familiar with the employability skills framework by trying to answer these questions. As you go, we welcome folks who want to put their answers to the questions in the Zoom chat. Anything I missed, Shira?
Nope, I think that's great. Yeah, we would love to, see what you're surfacing, what you're reflecting on, both in terms of how you see these design principles playing out, and then also what is that making you think about in relation to your own programs as well. So whatever you would want to share in the chat about what this is surfacing as you are digging in, that would be really helpful for your colleagues to see and think about alongside you. So we're going to put ourselves on mute, and let's give everybody, we budgeted quite a bit of time for this. Let's give everybody a full 15 minutes. So we'll come back at 49 after, and then we'll wrap up from there. Come back together just a little bit early. Folks who may want to drop in a final thought into the chat, please feel free to do so. I just want to wrap us up a little bit and share out a little bit of what I'm seeing in some of the reflections here. So we saw some reflections about the helpfulness of seeing a progression from kind of basic employability skills to more advanced employability skills, and the advanced including some that might be helpful in thinking about each individual's specific career choices. We saw some comments about the language being more clear and succinct and helping to think about what needs to be true at each level. We saw there's some feedback about the way in which this supports thinking about development of lessons and curriculum materials, and the way in which this is user-friendly for people to be able to understand the information embedded. So just to kind of think, build on that a little bit more, I think one or more people mentioned the idea of the sample artifacts. And I think that's also one to highlight around as we think about this question under critical thinking, the exploration of the critical thinking standard, under how we think about the components that help support the concept of measurability, which, as Molly had mentioned, was one of those things that really came up as a challenge around the previous employability skills, is what does it look like to measure this? And so we think about ways in which the design can help with that. So the idea of the progression, the idea of the differences in the levels helps us think about measurability. The idea of the sample artifacts can help us think about activities through which we can measure student development and mastery of these skills. The examples that are embedded within each level from novice to advanced help us think about ways in which we can be really concrete about what we are looking for and supporting students in developing, and what these skills really look like in practice. So there's a lot of ways that this framework helps solve a little bit of that previous challenge around how do we really take what has often in the past been called soft skills and make those soft skills feel more concrete and more measurable as we think about incorporating them more strategically into instruction in adult education contexts to really support learners in getting the skills that they need. So before I pass it, or before I wrap up just with that, I wanted to show you all the appendix, but before I do that, Molly, anything to add there?
Yeah, actually, Shira, I just wanted to highlight a question that came up in the Q&A that was about alignment. Now, many of you use different resources, curricular materials, web-based programs as part of your the materials that you use in your IETs. And so naturally the question is going to come up, well, how does this standards framework align with these materials or resources that I've purchased, right? I think that's a central question. We have a new standards framework. What, does it align with the materials or resources that are currently in our programs across the state? The central question, and I don't have knowledge of all the materials and resources across the lands that are in use, but the central question to ask is the program that you're currently using, are the materials that you're currently using aligned to Perkins? If the program that you've purchased or the resources that are being used aligns to the Perkins employability skills framework, then there is natural alignment and coherence with this new skills framework, because that was where the starting point. The strands are the same, sort of the overarching buckets of types of competencies are the same. Again, you've got critical thinking, you have interpersonal skills, and so on and so forth. So I would encourage everyone, if you're kind of scratching your head wondering, okay, what are the implications for instructional materials? To go and engage with vendors and to ask the question directly, does this align to the Perkins Employability Skills Framework? If so, this is really just a built out, more detailed version of that standards framework. It gives that level of detail. It gives some examples that are concrete. It provides that continuum, which again is really meant to enhance the utility, the usefulness of the standards for educators who are working with adult learners and trying to really understand what does interpersonal skills mean.
Great. Thank you for highlighting that question. Okay. So lastly, in the deck, which I know IPDE will make available to you, you'll also see the appendix that includes some additional design principles, which we didn't focus on today, but wanted to make sure you had those so you can also see how those connect to and play out in the standards framework. So I'm going to wrap us up here and pass it to June to close us out. So on behalf of me and Molly, thanks so much for your engagement today. We really appreciated the opportunity to talk through all of this new employability standards with you.
Thank you so much, Molly and Shira. So you have a feedback slide that is now appearing on your screen. If you would just take a minute to answer these 3 very short questions, we appreciate your feedback. And while you're doing that, I'll remind you that next week's webinar that will be held on May 25th is Excel Tricks and Tips. 30 tricks in 60 minutes. I don't think you're going to want to miss that. So we hope to see all of you again next week, May 25th, for Excel Tricks and Tips. Until then, thank you so much. Stay safe and we'll see you soon.